He stands sheepish in front of the jury who is eager to hang him. The hardened feminist jurors, whose fangs were already out, were just wondering why court proceedings were taking so long, because their singular duty was to say at the top of their lungs the word guilty. But how did Michel Coleman end up in the courtroom, accused of multiple murders and heinous crimes against his own family? It all started when his insolent daughter approached Mr. Coleman, his father, and asked him to teach her how to play guitar. Coleman was an enthusiastic guitar player and would wind his evenings stroking the strings of his acoustic guitar to distress and forget the day's troubles. Mr. Coleman worked for a metal processing company in which his boss was an insufferable man who took pleasure in making people miserable. He reluctantly agreed to teach his daughter. He did not want to teach her because he knew how troublesome she was. She was spoiled, careless, and took nothing seriously. Knowing guitar playing took a lot of commitment and discipline, he was apprehensive about many confrontations that were to follow, should the cheese girl not follow his instructions. He was also aware of his own impatience and hot temper. However, he thought this was a good opportunity to bond with his teenage girl, as their relationship was very strained. As expected, the guitar teaching was a cat-and-mouse game. Coleman, trying to get the girl to commit, sometimes using harsh words and a serious tone, and the girl, well, just being a spoiled teenage girl. On this fateful day, Mrs. Coleman had some of her friends come over to visit. She had recently given birth, and naturally ladies love coming over to hold the baby and to congratulate their fellow mother. Her teenage daughter, who was not feeling the vibe of these oldies, locked herself in her room with the father's guitar to keep herself busy plucking a few chords. When Coleman got home, he excused himself to relax on the balcony after a very stressful day at work. Mr. Coleman called his daughter to bring the guitar so he could also get lost in the soothing sounds of the aptly tuned strings. When she brought the guitar, 2 strings were hanging loose and detached from the fret. Annoyed at this sight, he asked the girl what had happened. Very cheekily, the daughter replied that she got bored playing and decided to play around removing the strings, and she did not know how to reattach them. Coleman was livid. He told her to immediately reattach the strings, failure to which she will be punished. She rolled her eyes and said, "Dude, I tried, but I failed. Deal with it." Mr. Coleman, burning in anger, jumped off the chair, held her by the hair, and smacked her with a very hot slap, the kind that leaves the hand imprinted on the cheeks for several hours. The girl screamed, asking to be left alone, but Coleman, still enraged, was still holding her by the hair, putting more handprints on her cheeks. When the girl could not take the beating anymore, she held the arm that was holding tightly to her hair and took a good bite of it until her teeth sunk deep inside her father's skin. With excruciating pain, Coleman released her hair as blood started oozing from the bite site. The girl took advantage of that moment to run away. She locked herself in her room. She was crying uncontrollably, not believing that anybody, let alone her father, would give her that kind of human panel beating. Mrs. Coleman, in the living room, was entertaining her visitors. She was unbothered by noises and screams coming from the other side, because that girl and her father always have something to fight about, she said to her visitors. Besides, teenagers, you know. The girl, overcome by severe emotions and grief, also with her cheeks swollen and burning from hot slaps she had just received, she decided she could not take that kind of humiliation. She tied a bedsheet over the roof fan and decided to hang herself. At the balcony, Mr. Coleman, still feeling the sting of sharp teeth sunken in his rough skin, looked at his bleeding arm, his guitar defaced, his ego bruised. He said, "No! This brat must be taught a lesson today. This is my house. I am the man here. No spoiled teenager will disrespect me in my own house." Coleman lamented on, "I will not be disrespected by my idiot boss and his degenerate son at work, and have the same happen to me in my own house. Never." He zoomed off to the daughter's room, forced the door open only to find her on the floor, a bedsheet tied around her neck and a huge roof fan broke on top of her head. You see, when she tried to hang herself, the fan couldn't sustain her weight, so after some time, it reaped off the roof, landing on her head, and its propellers got scattered on the floor. She lay down motionless with blood oozing from her nose and mouth. Perplexed and trying to piece that puzzle together, Mr. Coleman frantically called his wife while trying to untie the bedsheet off the girl's neck. The wife could hear him call, but she told her visitors, "Here we go again. I don't want to get involved in their squabbles." But the man kept calling helplessly as he tried to revive the girl. One visitor suggested to Mrs. Coleman to go check what was happening, as it sounded serious. "It sounds like Mr. Coleman is crying," the visitor exclaimed. So Mrs. Coleman stood up and slowly followed the man's voice to their daughter's room. As she neared the door, he bumped into Mr. Coleman, who had just stood up trying to leave the room. Immediately, Mrs. Coleman started complaining to her husband. She said, "You guys, even with visitors around, you can't keep it together? At least show some respect to my visitors. You're both behaving like spoiled teenagers." When Coleman heard his wife's remarks, he seized her by the shoulders and shouted, "You are the biggest problem here. You are very careless and insensitive. How long have I been calling you?" When the woman noticed blood on Coleman's hands, she said, "What have you done now?" Coleman held her again and smacked her against the door edge, saying angrily, "What a useless woman." She hit her head against the door edge and lost balance. She fell on top of one of the shuttered pieces of the fan's propeller. That metal tore through her ribs and her heart. All this while, Coleman had not noticed that his wife was holding their infant child, peacefully sleeping in her arms. When the wife lost balance, she let go of the baby and unfortunately fell on him on her way down. Mr. Coleman, regaining his senses, saw his whole family lying motionless in a pool of blood. He screamed in anguish at the top of his lungs, "What's going on? What's going on, I say?" This prompted the visitors to rush to see what was indeed going on. When they got to the daughter's room, they found Mr. Coleman holding his unconscious and bloodied wife in his hands, crying inconsolably. With a subdued voice, he said, "Call 911, please call 911. With enough witnesses to the crime, Mr. Coleman was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, that of his wife and his infant child, and 1 count of assault with grievous bodily harm that sent his teenage daughter into a long coma. If found guilty, he is staring at 2 life sentences without a possibility of parole. Are there any lessons to learn from Mr. Coleman's family tragedy? Please let us know in the comment section. This is Winning Mind with JFK Solace. Subscribe for more content of this nature.